Right, welcome back Year 11. It's been a while since I've done a specific video for you guys, and today's lesson is a little bit different to anything you've done so far in this kind of bridging and beyond sort of project. And we're going to focus on practical skills, and more specifically you guys are going to be planning your own investigation, your own experiment to see how lipase breaks down lipids. Okay, so practical skills are very, very important at Key Stage 5. You certainly did a lot when you were at GCSE, where you require practicals and so forth. And that kind of message still carries on into Key Stage 5. Now, if you're doing BTEC science, there's a lot of practical work. In fact, most of your work is sort of revolved around practicals and practical write-ups. And if you're doing A-level biology, you're going to still be doing practicals there. There are still required practicals to do, but there's much more emphasis on independence and you guys being able to, you know, follow a method, maybe even write your own methods and carry out the experiments yourselves without too much intervention from myself or other members of staff. So we need to kind of think about this, and I thought this would be a really good opportunity for you guys to do something to begin developing those skills on planning your own experiment. Now, of course, you're not going to do the experiment at home. You won't have access to the equipment and the appropriate enzymes. But in theory, this method that you're going to be writing could be used later on at Key Stage 5. And indeed, I believe in both syllabuses, BTEC and in A-level biology, you will be doing this practical, or one very similar to it. Okay, so let's get started. Now, for me, the beginning point of any kind of experiment is probably thinking a little bit about the theory, understanding the kind of the science behind it. So I said your experiment is to investigate a named variable on the action of lipase. So let's think about what lipase is. Well, lipase is an enzyme. Okay, it breaks down lipids. Okay, what does it break those lipids down into? Well, it breaks them down into fatty acids and glycerol. Okay, so that's quite important, understanding that basics. Now, enzymes like lipase are affected by many different factors, such as temperature, pH, the concentration of the substrate, so what they're actually breaking down, in this case the lipids, and also the concentration of enzymes. They're all different things, factors that you could investigate when it comes to enzymes. Once we've got this sort of basic understanding, now we can start thinking a little bit more about the practical application of them. And one of the most common things you can use with lipase is milk, because milk contains quite a lot of lipids, fats in there, and the lipase will begin to break down those lipids. Now, how could you measure, how could you see how the lipase is working? Well, you won't necessarily always be able to visually tell. The milk will look very similar throughout this entire digestion process. I mean, I can't visibly tell milk that's gone off unless it's really gone off, opposed to fresh milk. But what will happen is, as the lipase starts to break down those lipids, it will produce more and more of these fatty acids. Well, fatty acids will actually cause the pH of the solution to drop, become more acidic. Fatty acids, acid. So that's some way we could start to measure this reaction. We could measure this sort of change in pH. And there's many ways you could do that. You could use some, if you had the equipment, you could use maybe something like a pH probe, or you could use an indicator like phenolphthalein, which will change colour depending on the pH. And that's one that you could use and research in your methods that you guys are going to do. So now we've got a bit of an idea of the theory, the kind of the biology behind this enzyme. Let's start thinking about our next area, and that is scientific variables. So variables, there are three main categories of scientific variables. We've got our independent, our dependent, and our controls. Okay, so this is something that's been drummed into, or should have been, since year 7, but I find that students all the way up, even into A-level, still struggle with this concept, and it's actually one of the most important things when it comes to experiments and practical work, because this underpins everything that you're going to investigate in your experiment. So let's review each one in turn and think about how it might apply. So the independent variable is the thing that you are changing, it's the thing you are investigating. Okay, so some of those factors I said earlier, like temperature, for example, could be an independent variable in this experiment. If I change the temperature, it should affect how the enzyme works. The dependent variable is the thing that you are going to measure. Okay, and obviously it depends on the independent variable. So if I change this, then this happens, you see. So if I change the temperature, then the rate of reaction of the enzyme might change, and that's obviously something we can measure, right? The rate of reaction or time taken for it to do the reaction, okay? So you can see how those two link together. Now controls, you might have more than one, and I would suggest that you have multiple of these, are things that you need to keep the same in the experiment to make it a fair test. Because there are other factors at play that could affect how our enzyme's working. So if I had temperature as my independent variable, then I would have to maybe control other factors that might affect it, like the substrate concentration, or the type of milk, whatever, the fat content in the milk. I would have to control the enzyme concentration, so I need to make sure I'm using the same concentration of enzyme each time. Otherwise, that's going to be an interfering variable in our experiments. So they're sort of things that we need to keep in check, so bear that in mind. So that's a really good starting point. You know, what do I need to do? Plan those out. Think about those variables before you get going. And once you've got an idea of your variables, then you can move on to the next stage of the experiment, of planning process, sorry, which is writing a hypothesis. Okay, so a hypothesis is, sometimes students struggle with this, even I do a little bit, how to explain it. It's not a prediction. That is just a prediction. You can use a hypothesis to write a prediction. A hypothesis is applying your basic knowledge or preliminary results to come up with a kind of an idea of what might happen. So I think a good hypothesis should, to a certain extent, include your independent and your dependent variable. And often, I think an easy way of framing it is to include the words like if and then. So let's look at a really simple experiment, an idea. Imagine like I've got a ball, and I want to investigate the effect of how high I drop that ball affects its bounce. So the height at which I drop it would be my independent variable, and the bounce height would be the dependent variable. So my hypothesis could be something like this. If I drop the ball from a higher height, I should get a higher bounce. And so you can see I've used the words if and then, and I've incorporated my independent and my dependent variables. So once you've developed a hypothesis, you can then go about testing it, which is all about, you know, developing your practical behind it. Okay, so I highly recommend that you write a hypothesis, and in fact it's one of the sort of parts of the task, so have a go with that one. Okay, but it will depend on what you've decided to be your independent variable. So we'll move on and look at our next section, which is all going to be about values and measurements. Okay, so let's look at values and readings then. So I consider values linked with your independent variable. Okay, so these are things that you're going to measure when you're setting up your independent variable, and you've got to consider what your range is going to be. What is your min and max going to be? So if I had something like temperature, what's the minimum temperature I want to investigate? Maybe something like 10 degrees C, perhaps. All right, what am I going to go up to? Well, let's say maybe like, I don't know, 60 degrees C, okay? It's up to you what you do. So I've got that min-max range to my value for my independent variable. And you want to consider how many intermediates you're going to do there. Are you just going to do 10 and 60? Well, that's only going to give you 2 data points. And it comes down to timing, what is available, what equipment is available to you. But I always recommend having at least a minimum of 5 values that you're actually going to investigate for your independent variable. Okay, so that's quite important that you do that. So you can 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, and so on. So that would work for your values. Your readings, on the other hand, is what you're actually going to be recording, what you're going to be measuring during the experiment. And obviously that links to your dependent variable. Okay, so consider here what equipment you would need to measure that. So if you're measuring something like the fall of pH, you could use something like a pH probe, or you could use that indicator I mentioned before, phenolphthalein. And it will come down to probably either measuring the actual pH value itself, or maybe measuring something like time taken for it to go colourless or what have you. So consider there what equipment you need and how accurate that equipment is going to be. Also think about how often you're going to take these measurements. Are you going to do it every minute, every 5 minutes, every 30 seconds? Obviously this would require maybe a little bit of preliminary work to figure out what would be suitable. But have a look online and see what people do and what might be a good suggestion for your intervals when it comes to your readings. Okay, so now we've done our values and readings and think about what kind of we're going to be measuring the experiment. Let's move on to the next key part, which is actually writing the method. Actually, no, before we get to that, the equipment list. Before I get onto the old equipment, a cheeky cup of tea. King of the Malts is back. Beautiful, lovely cup that. Beautiful. Right, okay then, equipment. Sometimes students struggle with this one, and partly I find it's because they're not using accurate terms. Now I'm hoping at Key Stage 5 you wouldn't use something like a cup as a word, you'd use a word like a beaker. But we can do even better than just say a beaker. Tell me what type of beaker are you going to use? What kind of volume is it? Is it a 150ml beaker? Or is it, I don't know, a 350ml beaker? So being more specific like that is good. Also selecting appropriate equipment is very important, because you've got to be coming down to accuracy. Let's say I want to measure out 5 centimetres cubed of lipase solution, okay? I'm not going to use a beaker for that, because a beaker is going to be, its gradations are going to be up in like 50 centimetres cubed. So I'm not going to get the resolution I need to accurately measure out 5 centimetres cubed. You might say, oh, we'll use a measuring cylinder, but if I use 100ml or 100 centimetre cube measuring cylinder, again, I'm not going to probably get the accuracy I'm looking at. So if I used, I don't know, a 10 centimetre cubed measuring cylinder, I could quite accurately measure out 50 centimetres cubed. Or I could maybe even use like a syringe, a 5 centimetre cube syringe, to really get a very precise, accurate volume measurement. So think about that when you're selecting your equipment. What is the best optimum equipment to get your accuracy? And, you know, bullet them down before you write your actual method. Now you might think, you might not necessarily get all of your equipment to start off with. As you start writing it, you might realise, oh yeah, I might need another piece of equipment here. You know, it might even be something simple like a glass rod to stir the actual mixture to help the enzyme react with its substrate. But yes, it's very important that you get that equipment list there, because obviously it's going to help you assemble all your materials before you would do an actual experiment. So the next stage is arguably the most important. It's kind of pulling everything together we've looked at so far, and that is actually writing a method. All right then. So a method is a step-by-step guide on how to carry out an experiment. I often think of it as almost like an idiot's guide to do an experiment. In theory, if you've done a good job with this, your method could be carried out by a Year 7 student. And if you've written your method correctly, and as long as they follow the instructions, they should get valid, reproducible results from it. If you bake a cake, you follow a recipe, don't you? And in theory, if you follow that recipe accurately to the letter, you should get a perfect cake every single time. And that's the same with a method. You can't leave any holes or gaps in there. It has to be very clear what you're doing. So make it very, very precise, step by step. Don't look for those potential holes where somebody could misinterpret your information or forget something. As being as detailed and clear as possible will be very valuable when it comes to writing a decent method. And what you can always do, say if you're doing something like temperature as your independent variable, you can outline the whole experiment for 10 degrees C. And then once you've gone through all the steps, you can then say repeat the steps above for 20, 30, 40 and so on degrees C. So you don't have to sort of repeat yourself over and over again. You can outline the kind of the main procedures and then say repeat for the other aspects of your independent variable. So that's a good get around, and it makes it very clear and precise what to do. So that's a tricky one, and I do recommend that you look online for other suitable methods to give you an idea. Nuffield's a good website to look at, CleApps and things like that as well. But don't directly copy them. And I've got a point about that later on in the video, why it's important not to directly copy and paste a method from a website. So once you've written your method, the next thing you would do in an experiment is actually to write your results table. So we're going to have a look at writing out a results table and some tips and tricks I've got for that. So a good results table should include headings and also the appropriate units for that. And you should always construct a results table before you do an experiment, because I find lower down the school, and I imagine some of you might be guilty of this, that you almost sort of view a results table as somewhat a bit of a burden. Oh, I've got to fill in as I go along. But collecting results is the most important part of doing any kind of science. That's what it's all about, is actually gathering the results. So planning your table beforehand is essential. You can't be doing it on the fly because you might be missing, key measurements or observations that are going on. And it's a very, very important skill at Key Stage 5 to be able to definitely, without question, be able to construct your own results table. So my top tips for this is, now this is obviously a very simple one, and often you might find that there are more than 2 columns for any given results table. But the first column should always be what your independent variable is, okay? And the second column should always be the dependent variable. Never, never, ever just write independent variable and dependent variable, because that's not being specific. You already hopefully have identified what your independent variable is. That'll go in there. So it might be something like temperature or enzyme concentration, whatever it may be. And then likewise, be specific about what your dependent variable is. But they always go in that order. Okay. Another thing to input in there is units in brackets. So what are you actually measuring these in? So if it's like temperature, it could be like degrees C. If it's time, it's seconds. Okay. pH would be in pH. So make sure that they are in there, otherwise you're going to lose out on important marks. Never just write out the units below in the column, because it designates up here in the heading that they're all going to be in that unit. So one of the things I often see is students, if it's degrees C here, they'll be like 10 degrees C, 20 degrees C. Don't do that. Put the degrees C there. Every other value below there is in that unit. So you don't have to constantly repeat it, okay? That's the whole point of having a heading there. What you might find is that you might have multiple columns, and obviously these are potentially different components to your dependent variable. Maybe you're doing different measurements, or you're processing the results a little bit more. So usually the final column is the kind of the final bit of your dependent variable. So if you're doing a graph, for example, you would use that on your x-axis, and that final most would be on the y-axis, that dependent variable there. All right. So the last little tiny bit of this video is all about references and also about plagiarism as well. Okay. So references and plagiarism. So you will need to look for information online, books, textbooks, whatever it may be, to help you construct this. I don't expect you to suddenly go, oh yeah, I know exactly what to do when it comes to writing a method. It's challenging, it takes time and skill. So you can always use other websites, other information to help you support and construct your own methods. And that's very good. If you're going to use any of these sources, you almost must reference where you got them. So I'm not going to delve deeply into, say, the Harvard system of referencing at this stage, but something like a website, what I would do is have a little reference list at the end. I would copy and paste a URL followed by the date that you accessed it, because obviously websites change, and if somebody was to look at it 5 years down the line, they might see actually this information different. But if you put the date access, they know when you looked, and also you can also roll back and have a look at that earlier date. So always do that. That is a very, very important skill. And plagiarism obviously where you're copying someone else's work and pretending it's your own, and that's a big no-no anyway, and certainly is at Key Stage 5, particularly if you're doing something like BTEC and you are copying and pasting some other source's method and directly using it as your own. That's going to potentially cost you your actual qualification, get you kicked off, this is a terrible thing to happen. So there's nothing wrong with using information, as long as you A, reference it, and B, potentially restructure it or use elements of it, but not a wholesale copy and paste. Otherwise, it's not your work. You're not learning anything. You're not showing any skills. So don't fall into that trap. Go that extra mile. Use it as a base point. Modify it, change it to whatever you deem appropriate. Okay? So hopefully that's helped a little bit. This is a difficult thing, I know, and I'm not there to physically help you with it. And also with this one, instead of just giving me like an online happy, sad face, I would like you to submit me your finalised methods. It doesn't have to be today. You can do it later on in the week. It does take time. And I'll certainly give you some feedback on what you could maybe improve or what you could consider for the future. So this is Dr. P signing off. Stay safe. Enjoy the sunshine. Get that vitamin D levels up if you can. That's going to help you out, help boost your immune systems and all that. So have a good one.